On July 29, 1944, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force's 36th Fighter Group circled back toward the town of Rancy in western Normandy after finding few targets near Ville-d'Eu. What the pilots saw below stopped their chatter cold. A road packed with German vehicles stretched for over a mile. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery pieces, all of them jammed bumper to bumper, all of them trying to push south toward Coutances. And they weren't moving. At the head of the column, wreckage blocked the road. At the tail, Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armored Division had sealed the exit. The Germans were locked in place, and the P-47s were carrying a full load. The first flight radioed home that they'd found what one controller would later call a fighter-bomber's paradise. Operations scrambled every available squadron. For the rest of that long summer afternoon, the Thunderbolts rotated over the column in shifts, one group expending its bombs and ammunition, climbing away, the next already rolling in. By nightfall, the road between Rancy and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu looked like a junkyard designed by someone who hated the German army. 122 tanks destroyed, 259 other vehicles burning or blown apart, 11 artillery pieces shattered, 1,500 German soldiers killed or wounded, 4,000 more stumbling into American hands with their arms raised. The diary of the First Army called it the highlight of the day. Here is why that matters. Because Rancy was not a one-time event. It was the first movement of a pattern that would repeat, with increasing precision and increasing lethality, across the next 5 weeks and 400 miles, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the Belgian border. Falaise, the Seine crossings, Mons. Every time the German army attempted an organized retreat, the American pursuit machine caught it in the open and turned the withdrawal into a kill zone. Not once. Not twice. Every single time. If the men who built this system deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help their story reach the people who will never forget what they did. And that raises a question that the numbers alone cannot answer. Because the German army in 1944 was not some disorganized mob stumbling westward. These were the same officers and NCOs who had conducted fighting withdrawals across Russia for 2 years, from Stalingrad, from Kursk, from the Dnieper, extracting entire army groups through Soviet encirclements that should have been fatal. German retreat doctrine was arguably the finest in the world. They had written the manual on how to pull back under pressure, rearguard actions, leapfrogging defensive lines, moving heavy equipment at night to avoid air observation. They had done it 100 times on the Eastern Front and survived. So what changed? Why did a doctrine that had saved the Wehrmacht again and again in Russia collapse so completely in France? A captured German officer would later compare the retreat through Normandy to what he had survived in the East. His words were blunt. In Russia, he said, they at least retreated with their units still intact. In France, there were no intact units, only individuals and small groups trying to escape. Remember that comparison. Because the difference was not just Allied air superiority or the hedgerow terrain or the collapse of the front after Operation Cobra. Those were conditions. What turned conditions into catastrophe was something specific. A system the Americans had built in the weeks before the breakout. A system that welded air power and armor into a single instrument of pursuit that no retreating army had ever faced before. It was not a weapon. It was not a plan drawn up at Supreme Headquarters. It was an improvisation, born from a frustration that a 40-year-old brigadier general refused to accept, and it changed the way the American army fought for the rest of the war. The Germans had a word for the aircraft that delivered most of the punishment. They called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. Every veteran of the Western Front knew the word. Every column commander feared clear skies. But what the Germans did not understand, what they would not fully understand until it was far too late, was that the Yabos were not simply flying overhead looking for targets. They were being directed, in real time, by someone on the ground who could see what the tanks could see and speak the language the pilots understood. That someone was sitting inside a Sherman tank, and the man who put him there had never commanded a division in his life. Brigadier General Elwood Richard Quesada, everyone called him Pete, ran the 9th Tactical Air Command, the fighter bomber force assigned to support the American First Army. He was 40 years old, had been flying since 1924, and had spent the first weeks after D-Day watching a problem that was getting Americans killed. The problem was simple and brutal. Tanks on the ground could not talk to planes in the air. It sounds almost absurd. By the summer of 1944, the Allies had radar, sonar, encrypted radio networks spanning the Atlantic, and bombers that could hit a factory complex from 25,000 feet. But a Sherman tank commander who could see a German 88mm gun dug into a hedgerow 300 yards ahead had no way to tell the P-47 circling 1,000 feet above him where that gun was. The tank used Army frequencies. The Thunderbolt used Air Force VHF frequencies. Different radios, different wavelengths, different worlds. The system in place required a request to travel up from the company to the battalion, from the battalion to the division, from the division to an air support party, from the air support party to a fighter control center, and from the control center to the pilot. By the time the P-47 arrived, the target had moved, the tanks had moved, and the shells were falling on empty fields. In the hedgerows, where a single gun could hold an entire column for hours, minutes mattered. The system delivered hours. Quesada decided to skip the system entirely. What he wanted was deceptively simple. Take a VHF radio, the same set the P-47 pilots used to talk to each other, and put it inside a tank. Then put a pilot in the tank with it. Not a radio operator, not a liaison officer reading from a manual. A pilot. Someone who knew how to describe a target the way another pilot needed to hear it. Clock positions, terrain references, smoke markers. Someone who could look through the tank's periscope, see the gun that was killing Americans, and say to the Thunderbolt overhead, in language both men understood, "It is right there." Getting it done was harder than thinking of it. Quesada asked Ordnance to send a Sherman to his headquarters for the radio installation. The first tank was shipped to an armored division by mistake, which promptly absorbed it into its own fleet. A second Sherman arrived at 9 TAC, but nobody at the airfield knew what to do with a tank, and it was politely sent back. It took direct intervention from higher command to retrieve the machine and get the SCR-522 VHF set bolted in. But once it was done, once a pilot sat inside that turret with a radio tuned to the same frequency as the Thunderbolts overhead, something changed that no amount of doctrinal planning had achieved. The time between a tank crew spotting a threat and a 500-pound bomb landing on that threat dropped from hours to minutes. In some cases, seconds. Hold that fact. Because what Quesada had built was not just a communication fix. It was the nervous system of a pursuit machine that did not yet exist. A machine that would come to life the moment the front broke open and the Germans began to run. Before Cobra, the innovation was tested in the hedgerows, and it worked. P-47 flights, 4 to 8 aircraft, hovered over the lead elements of each armored column. They never returned to base until a relief flight arrived overhead. The tankers below painted fresh white stars on every vehicle and laid cerise and yellow panels across their engine decks so the pilots could see who was who. When the column hit resistance, the pilot in the tank talked the Thunderbolts onto the target. Obstacles that might have cost a battalion hours to reduce were eliminated in minutes. Then, on July 25th, the carpet bombing for Operation Cobra tore a hole in the German line west of St. Lo, and the tanks began to move. Not hedgerow by hedgerow anymore, They moved in columns, on roads, at speed, 30, 40 miles in a single day. And above every column, the thunderbolts moved with them. The Germans had never seen anything like it. Not in Russia, where the Soviet Air Force was dangerous but rarely coordinated with ground armor in real time. Not in North Africa, where the Luftwaffe had once owned the skies. This was something new, a predator that could see through the eyes of the prey's nearest enemy and strike before the prey could react. And now the prey was running. Because 4 days after Cobra blew the line open, the entire German position in western Normandy was collapsing. Divisions that had held the hedgerows for 7 weeks were pulling back, trying to regroup, trying to find a road south that was not already cut. They were about to discover that every road led to the same place. The road between Rancé and Saint-Denis-le-Gast was narrow even by Norman standards. A lane bordered by hedgerows so thick that 2 trucks could barely pass. In daylight, on July 28th, remnants of 7 German divisions were pushing into that lane, trying to reach Coutances before the Americans sealed it off. What was left of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich? Paratroopers from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, Panzer Grenadiers from the 17th SS, all of them tangled together, no longer fighting as divisions but as fragments, a company here, a platoon there, a column of trucks that no longer had a headquarters to report to. They were not panicking. These were experienced soldiers executing a fighting withdrawal, exactly as doctrine prescribed. They moved at night. They posted rear guards. A column of 30 vehicles rolled downhill toward American positions near Grimnil at 3:50 in the morning, with their engines off, coasting in silence. At the head of that column, a self-propelled 88 opened fire before the Americans at the roadblock even knew the Germans were there. For a few minutes it worked. The gun overran the forward positions of I Company, 41st Armored Infantry Regiment. Lieutenant Anderson's platoon was cut off. Men were dying in the dark. Then the system answered. American artillery found the road. Mortars walked up the column. The 88 gunner was killed by a sergeant named Lotz. And when dawn broke over Rancé, the P-47s came. What the pilots found was not a battlefield. It was a traffic jam in a slaughterhouse. Vehicles destroyed by artillery blocked the road in both directions. German soldiers who had abandoned their trucks were crouching in ditches, in farmyards, behind stone walls, while thunderbolts strafed anything that moved. The captain who had commanded I Company through the night fight, Walter Johnson, received a Silver Star. His comment was quieter than the citation. "I got a Silver Star out of it," he said. "But hell, I was just there. The other boys did the fighting." Rancé was supposed to be a lesson. The Germans were supposed to learn that retreating through a corridor under American air-ground coordination was suicide. But here is where the story turns. Because the lesson was not learned by the people who needed to learn it most. On August 7th, 9 days after Rancé, Adolf Hitler ordered a counterattack. Pay attention to what this means. The German front in Normandy had cracked. Patton's Third Army was already pouring through Avranches and racing east toward Le Mans. The logical move, the move every German field commander wanted, was to pull back, establish a new defensive line behind the Seine, and regroup. Instead, Hitler ordered what was left of his panzer reserves to attack west toward Mortain, to cut the narrow corridor at Avranches and trap Patton's army south of the breach. Operation Luttich threw 26,000 infantry and 300 panzers at the American 30th Infantry Division. The attack began at 1 in the morning precisely because the Germans knew what daylight meant. Daylight meant yabos. For 6 hours, in the dark, the attack gained ground. Mortain was overrun. But on a rocky height called Hill 314, 2 miles east of town, several companies of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment refused to move. They were surrounded. German mortars and 88s pounded them without pause. SS Panzer Grenadiers charged up the slopes. Every charge was broken by American artillery, called in by observers on the hilltop who could see the German formations gathering below. And then The sun came up. The 9th and 19th Tactical Air Commands launched everything they had. P-47s and P-51s ranged across the Mortain salient, hitting anything with a German cross on it. Tanks, trucks, horse-drawn carts, individual soldiers on bicycles. On August 8th alone, 19 TAC flew 717 sorties. Pilots reported destroying 505 motor vehicles, 93 horse-drawn wagons, 29 tanks. They cut 11 rail lines. They strafed 3 airfields around Paris. Within 48 hours, Operation Luttich was dead. But here is the fact that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The counterattack had not just failed. It had pushed the surviving German armored divisions 20 miles deeper into a pocket that was closing from 3 sides. Canadians from the north, Americans from the south and east. 21 German divisions were now west of a line between Falaise and Argentan, crowded into a shrinking rectangle of Norman countryside. Omar Bradley looked at the map and said 6 words that every officer in his headquarters understood. An opportunity like this, he said, comes to a commander not more than once in a century. The trap was almost shut. What happened inside it would become one of the most devastating passages in the entire war. And it was the Yabos, and the system that aimed them, that would turn the closing of that trap into something Eisenhower would later compare to a scene from Dante. On August 13th, 1944, 3 dozen P-47s from the 36th Fighter Group flew armed reconnaissance over the pocket west of Argentan. What they found below them was beyond anything the pilots had encountered in 2 months of ground attack missions over Normandy. 800 to 1,000 vehicles, milling about on the roads and in the fields, packed so tightly that individual trucks could not turn around. Tanks mixed with ambulances, mixed with horse-drawn ammunition wagons. Some were moving, most were not. The roads were blocked by wreckage from earlier strikes, and every side lane was jammed with vehicles that had tried to find alternate routes and failed. The Thunderbolts worked the area for an hour. When they climbed away, out of bombs and ammunition, they reported 400 to 500 vehicles destroyed. Fresh flights replaced them, and fresh flights after that. The rotation would continue, day after day, for a week. This was the Falaise pocket, and what was happening inside it was methodical destruction on an industrial scale. By August 16th, the pocket had shrunk to a rectangle roughly 30 miles long and 15 wide. 21 German divisions were crammed into that space, many of them down to battalion strength, most of them running on fumes. Hitler had finally authorized a withdrawal, 3 days too late. The only escape route ran east through a corridor between the towns of Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, and that corridor was barely 2 miles wide. Canadian and Polish forces pressed from the north. Americans held the southern shoulder. And above the entire pocket, from first light to last, Allied fighter bombers circled like patient birds over a shrinking pond. The Germans tried to move at night, but the roads were so clogged with destroyed vehicles that even darkness offered no protection. Columns backed up behind wreckage, and when dawn came, the Habos found them standing still. They tried to disperse into the fields, but the Norman countryside funneled everything back onto roads that crossed rivers at bridges, and the bridges were either destroyed or choked with burning trucks. Officers who had commanded divisions found themselves leading groups of 30 men through orchards, looking for a gap in the ring that might let them through on foot. Some made it. Remember this number because it matters for what comes next. Somewhere between 20 and 50,000 German soldiers escaped the Falaise pocket before it was sealed on August 21st. Most of them crossed on foot. Most left behind every tank, every gun, every truck they still possessed. General Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, estimated that perhaps 20,000 men, 25 tanks, and 50 artillery pieces got through, out of an original force that had numbered hundreds of thousands. What they left behind was something that hardened soldiers struggled to describe. The pocket was full of the dead, German, French civilian, and thousands of horses still harnessed to wagons, unable to flee, their wide eyes open. In the August heat, the smell reached pilots at altitude. Destroyed vehicles made some roads impassable for days. Maggots covered the bodies. Swarms of flies blackened the hedgerows. Eisenhower walked through it 48 hours after the gap was closed. He had seen North Africa. He had been briefed on every major engagement since Torch. Nothing had prepared him for this. He described the scene as one of the greatest killing fields of the war, a place whose horrors could only be described by Dante, where a man could walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The numbers confirmed what his eyes had seen. The Germans lost approximately 10,000 killed inside the pocket, 50,000 captured, nearly 500 tanks and assault guns abandoned or destroyed. The 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, the backbone of German strength in Normandy, had effectively ceased to exist as fighting formations. And yet, here is the fact that every American commander was already thinking about before the last shots were fired at Chambois. Tens of thousands had escaped. They had escaped without equipment, without organization, without fuel, but they had escaped. They were streaming east toward the Seine, and beyond the Seine lay the old fortifications of the Siegfried Line on the German border. If those men reached the Siegfried Line and were given new equipment, new divisions could be rebuilt. The catastrophe at Falaise would become a delay, not a death sentence. The pursuit system had crushed the pocket, but the pocket had leaked. And the Americans now faced a question that would define the next 3 weeks of the war. How do you prevent an army that is already running from reaching the one place where it can stop running and fight again? The answer was not to chase them, it was to beat them there. And one American general had already figured this out. Because while the Falaise pocket was still bleeding, George Patton had sent his fastest divisions racing east toward a river the Germans were counting on to save them. While the killing at Falaise was still underway, Patton was already 60 miles ahead of it. On August 15th, 6 days before the pocket was sealed, the lead elements of his Third Army were driving east toward the Seine. Not crawling through hedgerows, not reducing strongpoints village by village, racing. The 5th Armored Division and the 79th Infantry Division, under 15th Corps Commander Major General Wade Hayslip, had orders to reach the river at Mont-Gassicourt, 40 miles west of Paris, and get across before the Germans could organize a defense on the far bank. Patton had grasped something that the destruction at Falaise was about to make obvious. A pocket only works once. You can trap an army, bleed it, shatter its equipment, but the survivors learn. They scatter, they find new routes, they move faster next time. The only way to prevent a retreating enemy from reconstituting behind the next river is to arrive at that river first. The Seine was the river that mattered. It was wide, deep, and ran north-south across every German escape route from Normandy to the German border. If the Americans could seize crossings and cut the roads on the far bank, the tens of thousands streaming east from Falaise would hit the river and find the same thing they had found in the pocket: no way out. But there was a problem, and it was a problem the Americans had created for themselves. For weeks before the breakout, Allied bombers had systematically destroyed every bridge over the Seine north of Paris. The interdiction campaign had been designed to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. It had worked brilliantly. But now those missing bridges meant the Germans could not get their heavy equipment across the river, and neither could the Americans. The 79th Infantry Division solved that problem the old-fashioned way. On the night of August 19th, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling Wood, commanding the 313th Infantry Regiment, set up his command post in a hotel at Rollebois, overlooking the river and the town of Mont-Gassicourt. The far bank was quiet, but nobody trusted the quiet. Wood led a platoon across a dam at Rollebois on foot, probing for Germans. They found the dam undefended. Behind them, engineers from the 304th Engineer Battalion began constructing a pontoon bridge out of rubber boats, while German shells splashed into the water around them. By August 21st, the regiment was across. The 79th Infantry Division, the same division that had freed Cherbourg in less than 3 weeks, became the first American unit to cross the Seine. On that same day, a lieutenant named Robert Koffler drove alone from the bridgehead all the way to the outskirts of Versailles without encountering a single German soldier. The road to Paris was open. The road beyond Paris was open. The German army was not defending anything between the Seine and the Belgian border because it had nothing left to defend with. Now step back and see what had happened to the German retreat. The men who escaped Falaise arrived at the Seine in the last week of August. They found exactly what Patton had foreseen: a river with no bridges, American fighters overhead, and a pursuit force already established on the far bank. Field Marshal Model, who had replaced the dead Kluge as Commander-in-Chief West, ordered the crossings covered at all costs. His order was clear. The eastern wing must stand fast under any circumstances to safeguard the crossings of the lower Seine. Every vehicle that could move was to be ferried across at high pressure and without let-up. The Germans improvised. They used boats, barges, ferries, rafts, anything that floated. They crossed at night to avoid the Yabos. They concentrated remnants of SS Panzer divisions as rearguards to hold crossing points open. And by sheer desperation, they got men across. 165,000 German soldiers and 30,000 vehicles made it to the East Bank by the end of August. But look at what they left on the West Bank. Nearly every tank, nearly every heavy gun, nearly every piece of equipment that a modern army needs to fight. The Seine crossing was not a battle. It was a filter. Men went through. The army did not. And now those men, exhausted, disorganized, many of them without weapons, were walking east across northern France, trying to reach the Siegfried Line 300 miles away. They marched in fragments. A company from one division mixed with stragglers from 3 others. Officers who had commanded regiments now led columns of 50 men who did not know each other's names. They believed the worst was behind them. Falaise was behind them. The Seine was behind them. Ahead lay the German border, and behind that border, new equipment, new orders, new defensive positions built of concrete and steel. They did not know that the 3rd Armored Division had already crossed the Seine behind them, and it was moving faster than they were. On August 25, 1944, the 3rd Armored Division crossed the Seine at Tilly and began moving northeast at a speed that made its own headquarters nervous. The division they called Spearhead had spent July bleeding in the hedgerows, losing tanks to hidden guns, grinding forward field by field, measuring progress in hundreds of yards. That war was over. The war now was a race, and the 3rd Armored was running it at 40 miles a day. Major General J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe, commanded the 7th Corps that the 3rd Armored spearheaded. Collins was 48, wiry, impatient, and had a habit of pushing his divisions harder than anyone above him authorized. His corps also included the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 9th Infantry Division. All 3 were veteran outfits, all 3 were moving fast, and all 3 were burning fuel at a rate that terrified the supply officers behind them. On the 26th, the 3rd Armored reached and crossed the Marne at La Ferté and Meaux. The 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions followed close behind. And the 28th, they crossed the Aisne at Soissons. 3 days after that, the lead tanks were at Laon, then Marle, then across the Belgian border, the 1st American Division to enter Belgium. In 6 days, Spearhead had covered the distance from the Seine to the frontier. The French countryside rolled past in a blur of liberated villages, cheering crowds, and abandoned German equipment rusting in the ditches. And above the columns, the Jabos kept pace. The system Quesada had built for the hedgerows now operated at pursuit speed. P-47 flights rotated over the armored spearheads in continuous shifts, scouting the roads ahead, reporting back to the pilots riding inside the lead tanks. When the tankers hit a roadblock, the Thunderbolts were already rolling in. When a German rearguard dug in at a crossroads, it was spotted from the air before the first Sherman came around the bend. The air-ground team that had been born as an improvisation in June was now a polished instrument, and it was covering ground faster than any army had moved in this war. But here is the detail that matters most, and it is easy to miss if you are watching the arrows on the map. The 3rd Armored was not chasing the Germans. It was outrunning them. The retreating German columns, on foot, on bicycles, in horse-drawn wagons, were moving east at 15, maybe 20 miles a day. The American armor was moving at 40, which meant that with every passing hour, the Americans were getting further ahead of the men they were pursuing. Collins understood what this meant. He was not trying to catch the retreating Germans from behind. He was trying to get in front of them. If his corps could swing north and cut across the German line of retreat, the same thing that happened at Falaise and the same thing that happened at the Seine would happen again. Only this time, the Americans would not be closing a pocket from two sides. They would be sitting across the road waiting when the Germans walked into them. On August 31st, Collins received orders to turn his corps north, away from the German border, toward the Belgian towns of Avesnes, Maubeuge, and Mons. He did not know exactly what was ahead of him. Neither did anyone at 1st Army headquarters. What nobody on the American side yet realized was that the largest concentration of retreating German forces in northern France, roughly 70,000 men from the remnants of 20 shattered divisions, was marching directly toward the same road junction that Collins was racing to reach. 3 corps headquarters had merged into a single improvised command under General Erich Straube. The 58th Panzer Corps, the 74th Army Corps, and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, all of them commanding formations that existed mostly on paper. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Division had been reduced to 2 infantry battalions. The 18th Luftwaffe Field Division was down to a single battalion. Around these skeletons gathered a mass of stragglers, depot personnel, supply troops, and men from units that no longer had designations. They had almost no fuel, almost no ammunition, almost no communication with each other or with higher command. They were moving east by instinct, following the roads toward Germany, trusting that the speed of their retreat would keep them ahead of whoever was behind them. They were not looking ahead. On the morning of September 2nd, the 83rd Armored Reconnaissance Battalion of the 3rd Armored Division pushed into the outskirts of Mons. The Belgian resistance met them with flowers and intelligence. There were Germans coming, the Belgians said, thousands of them, coming from the west and the southwest on every road, and they did not know that anyone was waiting for them. Collins still did not grasp the scale of what was about to happen. He was about to stumble into the 2nd largest German surrender of the entire campaign in the West, and it would cost him fewer men than a single bad afternoon in the hedgerows. The collision at Mons was an accident. Both sides stumbled into it, but only one side had the system to exploit what happened next. On the night of September 2nd, the 3rd Armored Division had its tanks strung out for 25 miles along the road from Avesnes to Mons. The 1st Infantry Division was pushing into Avesnes from the southwest. The 9th Infantry Division was further east, near Charleroi. None of them knew that the largest body of retreating German troops in northern France was walking straight toward them on roads that converged at Mons like spokes on a wheel. The first contact came after dark. German columns moving east on the road between Avesnes and Mons ran into American roadblocks. Sherman tanks parked across intersections, machine guns dug in along the shoulders, tank destroyers covering the approaches. The Germans did not expect resistance. They expected empty roads and a clear path to the border. What they got was fire from positions they could not see, on ground they did not know was held. A tank unit of the 3rd Armored found a German column a mile long on a road south of Mons and destroyed it end to end. The lead vehicles were hit first, then the tail, and then everything in between burned where it stood. When dawn came on September 3rd, the fields and roads around the Borinage, the old industrial region south of Mons, were littered with the debris of an army that had disintegrated overnight. What followed was not a battle. It was a harvest. In the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division, a private named Gino Merli was manning a machine gun when his position was overrun. The Germans swept past him in the dark, and Merli went limp among the dead. He was not dead. He lay still while German boots passed within arm's reach, and when the next wave came, he rose and fired. He went limp again when they closed. He fired again when they came. He did this all night, alone, at a single gun. When the sun came up, more than 50 German dead lay in front of his position. Merli would receive the Medal of Honor, one of the few infantrymen in the European theater to earn it for a single night's action. But Merli's fight was an exception. Most of the Germans around Mons had no fight left in them. 70,000 men were caught in the pocket. They had no fuel to move their vehicles. They had no ammunition to fight their way through. They had no communications to coordinate a breakout. The 3 corps headquarters that had been thrown together under General Straub could not even reach each other by radio. Units blundered into American roadblocks, milled in confusion, and surrendered in groups that grew larger as the day went on. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. And then the air arrived. On September 3rd, the 9th Tactical Air Command found the German columns packed on the roads around Mons, the same way the fighter bombers had found them at Rancé, the same way they had found them at Falaise, the same way they had found them at the Seine crossings. The pattern was identical. The result was identical. Pilots reported destroying 851 motor vehicles, 50 armored vehicles, and 652 horse-drawn wagons in a single day. The horse-drawn wagons tell you everything about what the German army had become. An army that had started the war with panzers was now retreating in farm carts. The 3rd Armored Division ran out of gasoline on September 3rd and could not move for 24 hours. It did not matter. While the tanks sat idle, the crews took 2,500 prisoners without leaving their positions. One tanker's summary went into the division log and stayed in the unit's memory for decades. Hunting was excellent. By September 5th, the pocket was empty. 25,000 Germans had surrendered. 3,500 were dead. The Americans had captured 40 armored vehicles, 100 half-tracks, 120 artillery pieces, 100 anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, and nearly 2,000 trucks and wagons. German losses at Mons were the second highest of any single engagement in the Western campaign, exceeded only by Falaise itself. American casualties for the entire battle: 57 killed in the 3rd Armored Division, 32 killed and 93 wounded in the 1st Infantry Division, 2 tanks lost, 1 tank destroyer, 20 vehicles. The pocket at Mons had ripped a gap 75 kilometers wide in the German front. On that same day, September 3rd, Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced Kluge barely 2 weeks earlier, made the decision that every German commander had been dreading since Cobra. He declared that it was impossible to hold positions in northern France and Belgium. He ordered a full withdrawal to the Siegfried Line. The retreat that the finest doctrine in the world was supposed to manage had turned into a 5-week catastrophe, stretching from Rancé to the Belgian border. And the machine that broke it, the machine that turned every German withdrawal into a kill zone, was still running. On September 10, 1944, 6 weeks and 1 day after the Thunderbolts circled over Rancé, a gun crew from the 3rd Armored Division fired what the division claimed was the first American field artillery shell onto German soil. 2 days later, Spearhead crossed the border and pushed into the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line. The race was over. The Germans had reached their fortifications, and the long, bloody slog of autumn, Hurtgen Forest, Aachen, the Bulge, was about to begin. But the 5 weeks between Cobra and the German border had already decided something that no amount of concrete could reverse. The army that reached the Siegfried Line was not the army that had held Normandy. It was a skeleton, dressed in new uniforms, given new equipment it did not have time to learn, and told to hold a line that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, with divisions that existed only on paper. The numbers tell part of that story. Between the end of July and the first week of September 1944, the German army in the West lost roughly 300,000 men killed or captured. It lost virtually all of its tanks, most of its artillery, and nearly every vehicle it had brought into France. At Rancé, the pursuit system caught its first column and proved the concept. At Falaise, it scaled to an entire army group and shattered it. At the Seine, it turned a river crossing into a filter that stripped the retreating army of everything heavy enough to sink a boat. At Mons, it caught the survivors a second time and proved that the system worked even when the Americans themselves had outrun their own fuel supply. 4 pockets in 5 weeks, each one worse for the Germans than the last. Not because the Americans simply had more planes or more tanks, though they did, but because the pursuit machine learned. After Rancé, the air-ground teams refined how they rotated flights over moving columns. After Falaise, Patton understood that the next trap had to be set ahead of the retreat, not behind it. After the Seine, Collins grasped that speed alone could create encirclement, that a corps moving faster than the enemy was retreating would end up in front of it without needing a second pincer. Each pocket fed lessons into the next. Each lesson made the system faster, more precise, harder to escape. The Germans adapted too. They moved at night. They dispersed into small groups. They used rear guards to buy time. These were the same techniques that had saved entire army groups in Russia. But in France, every adaptation met a counter-adaptation that arrived sooner. Night marches stalled behind roads clogged with wreckage from daytime strikes. Dispersal meant units lost contact with each other and wandered into roadblocks they could not see. Rear guards were spotted from the air and reported to the tanks before the first shot was fired. The German officer who compared France to Russia had been exactly right. In Russia, they retreated with their units intact. In France, the American pursuit system broke the units apart and then destroyed the pieces individually. The difference was not courage. The difference was not doctrine. The difference was a machine that fused air and armor and the speed of decision-making at every level into a single instrument, an instrument that no retreating army in the world had ever had to face, and that no doctrine written before 1944 had been designed to survive. Quesada never commanded a division. He finished the war as a major general, led the Tactical Air Command in peacetime, served as the first head of the Federal Aviation Administration, and died in Washington in 1993 at the age of 88. The radio he bolted into a Sherman tank that summer became the foundation of every close air support system the United States military has built since. Lightning Joe Collins took 7th Corps from Normandy to the Elbe. His men breached the Siegfried Line, captured Cologne, and crossed the Rhine at Remagen. After the war, he served as Army Chief of Staff during Korea. Gino Merli went home to Peckville, Pennsylvania. He worked for the Veterans Administration for 30 years. He rarely spoke about the night at Mons. He died in 2002 at the age of 78. The 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead, lost more tanks than any American division in the war. It also went further, faster, and hit harder than any of them. The men who crewed those Shermans in the summer of '44 built something that had no name at the time and no manual to describe it. They simply drove forward until the enemy was behind them, called the Jabos down on what was left, and kept driving. The Germans had the best retreat doctrine in the world. The Americans built a pursuit system that made it irrelevant. Thank you for watching this all the way through. If this story meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these stories find the people who want to hear them. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be grateful if you hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop your country in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, on any front, in any branch, tell us about them. These men built something extraordinary, and their stories deserve to be heard.